If you ask a writer which of the writing rules are more like guidelines, they're probably going to say all of them. So, while there are writers who can break every rule in the house and make it work just on the strength of their writing, most of us have to be a little more intentional with our words. Knowing what each rule does and how it works makes breaking a rule into a tool for your writer's toolbox. Personally, I like to know the rules and follow them unless I have a reason not to. Welcome back to Morgan's Writing Tips and Writerly Musings with writing tips from the pros and, of course, my own writerly musings. I'm your host, Morgan Hazelwood, and today I'm here with which writing tips are more like guidelines. First up, show, don't tell. So, what is this showing versus telling? We hear this all the time. In writing, showing is when you describe something happening, and telling is when you explain what happened at a higher level, often sort of a summary. Showing. He trudged across the plains, feet aching, as the summer sun took its time setting. Telling. It took all day for him to cross the plains. So, why do we avoid it? Showing is more dynamic, full of description, action, and dialogue. Why might we want to tell? To quickly tell a shift in time or location, or simply skim over events that need to be explained but aren't vital for the plot to be on the page. Next guideline, don't use passive voice. So, what is this passive voice? Passive voice is when you decenter the verb, the action, away from the subject performing it, typically identified by having a helping verb in the form of the verb to be. Am, is, was, were, be, being, been, paired with another verb, excluding when you're doing past or future tense and you need the helping verb there. So, an example passive voice is 5 people were attacked by a Cape Crusader. The active voice would be a caped crusader attacked 5 people. In the active voice, our subject is a caped crusader. Our verb slash action is attacked, and our direct object is people. 5 in this sentence is being used as an adjective or quantifier. So, why do we avoid passive voice? Active voice is more dynamic and gives ownership of the action to the one performing it. Or passive voice can be a form of telling instead of showing. So, why might we want to use passive voice? When the character doesn't have control of the situation, passive voice can help highlight their lack of control. Passive voice can also be used to distance the reader from the action, to make them care just a little bit less. And it can be used in scene transitions to jump time or location. Next guideline, don't use adverbs. So, what's an adverb? Adverbs modify a verb, another adverb, or an adjective, a word that describes a noun. They describe how, when, where, how often, and how much. A large majority of adverbs can be identified by searching for words that end with the letters ly, but not all words that end in ly are adjectives. Adverbs such as quickly, tomorrow, repeatedly, slowest. So, why do we avoid adverbs? They can be a form of telling instead of showing. Plus, they can usually be replaced by a stronger verb. Walked slowly turns into strolled. So, why might we want to use adverbs? Well, there are times when removing an adverb, even with the replacement of a stronger verb, loses meaning. Adverbs describing how something is done are simpler to remove, typically. It can also be a stylistic choice for when the character doesn't have control of the situation to highlight their lack of control or to distance the reader from the action. So we walk slowly. The next guideline is don't use sentence fragments. What's a sentence fragment? Well, in English, a sentence has a subject and a verb, often with more language to expound upon the situation. Even when giving an order like march, the subject is you and it's inferred, and that sense is called an imperative sentence. Anyway, sentence fragments are phrases that don't contain both a subject and a verb. A full sentence, she ate the sandwich. A fragment, eating the sandwich. So, why do we avoid sentence fragments? Well, they're incomplete sentences and thus poor grammar. Why might we want to use them? Well, it can be part of the writer's voice. Sometimes it's a thought they want the reader to sit with, while other times it's a way to build tension during action scenes. Short paragraphs and sentences, even fragments, read faster and give the scene more speed and urgency. Next guideline, don't end a sentence with the preposition. So, what's a preposition? A preposition is a word that describes a noun's relationship to something else. So, some prepositions are on, under, around, across, in, at, and they can be used in prepositional phrases like around the corner, across the street, in the closet, under the stairs. So, why do we avoid prepositions or ending sentences with them? Well, there's a grammar rule that was pulled in from Latin that says we're not supposed to. I usually try to avoid ending a sentence with one, but why might we want to use them? Well, sometimes rewording a sentence to not end the preposition would be harder and make the sentence harder to read and parse properly, or the intended concept would be lost. Example, it's a thought that they want this reader to sit with. So, next guideline, write what you know. What does this even mean? Well, a writer should take places and experiences from their own life and knowledge and build their story off of that. Or should they? So, why should we avoid things we don't know? Readers are great at seeing the holes in our stories. If you write about something you have little experience or knowledge about, they will find the holes and expose them. Whenever you get a detail wrong, there will be some readers just knocked out of the story long enough that some of them might just put down the book and walk away. So, why might we want to use things we don't know? Well, most genre fiction is built off of things we will never experience: galactic empires, floating castles, serial killers, or true fated mates. But how we create our stories is by building off of our core understanding of what humanity is, blended with either all of our hopes and dreams and the heights we can rise to, or our fears and nightmares and the depths we can sink to, or perhaps combining our dreams and our nightmares. No matter the setting or the characters, we can draw on our own experiences of hopes, ambitions, family drama, fears, and love to imbue our imaginary worlds with what we know. Next guideline, well, the complexity of asides. What does this mean? In writing, an author often wants to give further information about a subject within a sentence. While these can be demarcated in a variety of ways, typically an author will pick one or two and use those methods throughout their entire works. The options: one, comma separated. For example, Vasilissa picked a path across the rocks and the piles of pungent kelp-like, comma, a scent as salty and bitter as the sea. Next up, we have parentheticals. After that comma, let's put some parentheses around a scent as salty and bitter as the sea. Maybe we want it as a footnote note. After the word kelp-like, let's put a little superscript and put that comment at the bottom. And dashes. They're like super long hyphens um, with spaces on both sides. And of course, there's always the classic colon before that, as scent is salty and bitter as the sea. Now, academic works lean toward the semicolon and footnotes, bloggers like the parentheticals. Comma separated and parentheticals used to be the go to in fiction, but now authors are leaning more toward em dashes. Note, an em dash is typically typed as two hyphens that are then joined into a slightly wider single line by most writing applications like Word and Google Docs. N dashes with an EN are typically typed as a space before a hyphen, and most writing applications turn it into a slightly longer dash. And it's used for conjoining separate words or showing a range, usually of dates. Hyphens are used for adding prefixes and suffixes to words and hyphenating compound words. Only the copy editor will generally notice if you confuse an en dash and a hyphen. Most people can spot the difference between those and an em dash. And fun fact, en dashes are used as em dashes in British writing. Secondary note, semicolons are typically used to combine two independent clauses with their own subjects and verbs. They could stand alone as sentences or be conjoined with a conjunction like but, yet, or however, or simply with the semicolon. Colons are used for subordinate clauses that don't have their own subject and verb. So, which should you use? Typically, one uses the standard method for the genre one is working in. More literary fiction might tend toward this academically styled semicolons and footnotes. So, next guideline, start at the beginning and go to the end. So, why do we want to write in order? Well, stories have a beginning, middle, and end. We have to know who the characters are before stuff happens to them, and we have to know where they end up, right? So, why might we want to write out of order? Well, first off, the reader has no clue what order you wrote in. Many authors know some scenes and write the ones that excite them in the moment, jumping around. While that doesn't usually work for me, it is tried and true for some authors. Secondly, not all stories are linear. Some stories start at the climax and jump back to show us how we got there. Other stories have parallel plots between now and flashbacks, often showing how we got to the present situation. And there are stories that follow multiple characters, and the timelines may vary between them. And other stories simply follow a narrative flow, even while they jump around in time, because it makes sense to the narrative. Thirdly, nonlinear stories work really well for the unreliable narrator trope. If you hide key scenes or comments from the reader until later, you can have the bigger reveal. So, this leads into the next guideline of don't write a sentence out of order. So, what's an out of order sentence? Writers often add phrases to a sentence showing a reaction before describing the event. Out of order. Um, Lilivan's magic is nearly revealed to the hostel when she accidentally triggers her magic while praying. Well, let's flip that around. In order, it's while praying, Lilivan accidentally triggers her magic, nearly revealing her magic to the hostel. I know we repeat the word magic, but it's in order now. So, why should we avoid out of order sentences? They're harder for the reader to properly parse. Why might we write out of order? Well, sometimes we want the focus to be on the first part of the sentence and not the second. And sometimes the order doesn't matter. So it's up to you, but do be aware of when you do it. Next guideline, characters must change. So, why must characters change? Stories tend to not just have a plot arc, but also an emotional arc in which the main character or characters run into trouble, often made worse by a character flaw, are taught how to overcome this flaw and succeed in the end. The story shows the character growing into a better person or a worse person, depending on the story, but in either case, they change. So, why might we not want the characters to change? Usually, stagnant characters are part of a series, typically detective stories and that sort of thing. Stories where the reader just wants to come back for another episode of the main character just doing their thing. That can be comfort reading. Sometimes stagnant characters are part of the theme of the story, usually ending up with the character back in the same place or a worse place at the end of it. These stories are often fatalistic or emphasize the futility of fighting against something. A little more basic. Let's talk about the guideline I before E. In English, when learning to spell, we're often taught the rhyme I before E except after C or as a neighbor in way. Except this is English and there are more exceptions to the rules than followers. Some followers believe, chief, field, achieve, fierce, and die. Listed rhyme exceptions receive, neighbor, way. Exceptions weird, science, sees, there, air, society. Wow. Next guideline avoid adjectives. So, what's an adjective? Adjectives describe a noun. Sometimes multiple adjectives are given for a single noun. So, why do we want to avoid them? Well, too much description can slow the pacing of the story. Action and dialogue often read much faster and keep the tension higher. Description tends to lower the tension and slow the reading of the story. Some writers also end up writing what is known as quote unquote purple prose. What's that? Well, Wikipedia defines it as overly ornate prose text that may disrupt a narrative flow by drawing undesirable attention to its own extravagant style of writing, thereby diminishing the appreciation of the prose overall. Purple prose is characterized by excessive use of adjectives, adverbs, and metaphors. So, why might we use adjectives? Well, if a character, place, or object is important to the scene, they should be described at least somewhat for the readers. We want to avoid white room syndrome where we don't know what the character or the space looks like. So, some writers also have what is known as lyrical voices, which tend toward more descriptive and poetic voices. Adjectives aren't a major problem until they start to slow the reading. And sometimes we want to slow down and let the reader catch their breath after an intense action or dialogue scene. Maybe there's an argument, whatever. So do remember to use them in moderation, though. A list of more than three descriptors starts to get a little unwieldy. Oh, so that's a lot. That's a lot. Closing thoughts. While this is far from an exhaustive list, hopefully understanding what is meant by these rules, how they work, and why one might want to break these rules will help you use your words more intentionally. Are there any rules you like to break? Any guidelines that I missed? Let me know in the comments below. As always, thanks for watching and tune in again next week for more writing tips and writerly musings. Bye bye.